You're with Alan Juddy, and this is another episode of Seed Dating, the podcast where we meet one of Agricom's forage products, learn about its attributes, and match it to your farm system. And here to help us nurture this new blossoming relationship is our very own forage relationship expert, Alistair Moorhead. Hi, Al, and who are we going to meet today?
Hi, Juddy. Brace for impact. Let's meet Brace White Clover, an all-season producer.
Yeah.
Yeah, Juddy. Brace is a new generation large leaf white clover bred here in New Zealand.
Well, big broad leaves like that, you could probably call it wide clover.
Oh, really, Juddy? It's just white clover.
So tell us a little bit about this large leafed white clover. How does it differ from our traditional types?
Oh, I think the key there is that in general, we sort of categorise the styles in New Zealand in three leaf size groups.
Right. So what are they?
So technically, you would probably say there is a small to medium size.
Yep.
The way I often describe that is that that's a sort of white clover that you use if you can see a golf ball in a paddock for about 3 to 4 months a year.
Right.
Do you sort of get a picture of where
so
I'm talking
low
about?
grazing
Spreading,
residuals.
dense ground cover, eco-type landscapes where actually leaf size can get quite small under stress and to protect itself. So you want a style of clover that can be productive in a good day, but can hunker down on these dry and consistently stocked landscapes. So that's that small to medium size. We have a category that probably is quite universal in its usage, and that we'd describe as a medium to large leaf type. And that would sit in landscapes that may be set stocked, and you may see a golf ball, but probably only for a couple months of the year.
Yep.
But just as likely, you're going to be grazed by cattle, and therefore your grass covers are going to be high as well. And so you've got to be able to tolerate and grow up into a canopy and have a good leaf size for a silage system or a higher fertility production system where grass is really competitive as well.
So that can kind of move both ways.
Yeah, that's correct.
Small
that's correct. That's correct.
High. Yep.
And I suppose you'd describe that as the most plastic of styles, the medium to large category. And then you've got the bigger and more dominant leaf size, which is really designed for highly competitive, highly fertile, summer moist pastoral systems. Really productive.
And that's what we're talking. Brace is one of those.
Big Bad Brace is exactly what we're going to talk about here today, because really at the heart of it, it is very much about competitiveness and highly productive pasture.
So what's the backstory to this one? How did you come across this one?
Look, this is a third generation over a period of 20 years of large leaf white clover that we've brought to market, and really the standout features of this is that recognising that, again, we've got a little bit of climate creep coming into our world, and one of the traits of that is our autumns are getting warmer, our winters are getting warmer, but not warm enough for clovers to be special in New Zealand. And so, but warm enough for grasses to become more and more competitive in the cool season. So the backstory to clover, not wanting to dwell on it too much, is that it really excels at 20-degree air temperatures, whereas in New Zealand, the predominant grass species we use is ryegrass, which loves temperatures around the average temperature of about 18 degrees. And so the longer you're in periods that are highly active for ryegrass, the tougher it is on clover to be competitive. And the backstory to Brace is, again, a breeding program that is focused on the densest and most productive styles of grasses to breed your clover with, recognizing that the success of clover is in its competition with productive grasses. And so the weakness really of getting an increased clover content on farm is, can we tolerate shading for long periods of time, and can we compete in the canopy of a grass pasture for long periods of time, particularly when the weather conditions aren't perfect for clover growth?
So the strategy for Brace is to get into that canopy, big leaves, and be very competitive with that.
Absolutely. Find its space, like all white clovers. They love finding a bit of space, but in a productive grass landscape, sometimes space is hard to find. So you got to dominate your space, and you got to be present in the areas that you manage to compete in. And I can't emphasize enough, I didn't bring it up, but this is the key trait that I appreciated from bringing Brace into our portfolio, is its autumn and winter activity, which is a lower yield potential time of year than the spring and summer, where you get most of your clover yield from, the sweet spot for clover growth. the key to Brace's autumn and winter activity is just what I defined. It's competing with grass enough to be present until the good times for clover come in spring and summer.
Yeah.
Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I guess so where you're going into these cooler periods, even though you know that it's tough on clover, what you've got is a cultivar that's able to battle through that.
It's upright enough to be present in the canopy in cooler conditions. It can contribute during those cool conditions, maybe not outrageously productive as far as when totally it grows its feed, but by being present early, it gets a slingshot start to being present and productive when it grows the most, which is in spring and summer.
And with these big leaves and being there in that autumn and winter period to compete with that grass, often we get a comment about it's a very visual clover.
Correct.
And so that must be in terms of, one, its leaf size, because you're sort of drawn to that. But I think the other point you've made it really well is that it's in the pasture being competitive at times when other clovers find that quite difficult.
Absolutely. And like I say, the biggest issue for clovers consistency in pasture is grass. And so the more grass you grow, the harder your world is of keeping a solid and constant content of clover. It tends to come in cycles.
So thinking about farm systems now, what are the farm systems that would lend themselves to having a large leaf white clover in the pasture?
Well, for me, Brace would be suitable for all high producing grass pastures. So the moment you've got a rotation with highish covers, a rotation when you're driving for a high total annual yield, Brace has its own yield potential. It can contribute to achieving those yields itself by just growing forage, but also just being present in high performance pasture we've just defined it as a big deal. So it being present. Remember, all white clovers bring nitrogen with them, so that helps them compete. And I just can't emphasize enough, not all clovers are the same with the amount of dry matter they produce, and the amount of dry matter they produce reflects the amount of nitrogen they bring to your pasture. Brace at this moment would be one of the highest cyclers of nutrient I've seen in our trial systems, and it looks awesome with the way it contributes all the time, cycling that little bit of N into your pasture on a regular basis, and looking at what it can convert to total pasture growth. Brace reflects that in its ability to produce, bringing free nitrogen into your landscape as well.
And so for guys who are wanting to use this, as a silage crop, for example,
absolutely,
is that a role
silage, for high performance dairy pasture, particularly runoff blocks where you're producing large amounts of silage? Your biggest issue there is relatively high covers. And so, maintaining canopy and high covers is a big deal. Also bounce back after a cut. Everything's uniformly cut. You go through a time when you removed a lot of nitrogen. So clovers actually get an advantage after a silage cut. And, the one thing about Brace is the speed of which it can actually contribute to the next regrowth cycle is huge in a silage system. But probably the average clover content of a dairy pasture in New Zealand sits between 8 and 12%. That's in a whole calendar year. It may be greater at key points of time, but for total yield, moving that from 12% to 14% to 16% to 20% of total pasture cover brings milk solids to a vat. It brings more nitrogen into your pasture rotation, potentially giving you a bigger upper limit of how much you're going to grow in a calendar year. That's what Brace will offer.
Yeah, and of course, from a dry stock operation, it brings you protein and growth rate.
Yep, and
which
silage
is really
quality, recovery from silage cuts, growing out young stock really well, particularly cattle.
One question for you. Thinking about the white clovers that we're putting into a pasture, is it something that you would it would be the only white clover, or is there some cases where you might use both a large leaf and a medium leaf, for example?
Yeah, well, the way I'd look at it is the style has been defined by attempting to continue to breed it for resilience and perenniality, but it never changes the dynamic that those other categories I described are more resilient when pastures are more open. So the more grass you have in your landscape, the more I rely on Brace to be your driver. The more open your pastures may become, I would consider using something like a new product of ours called a Tribute to support it, a medium large leaf with a large. And I say that because stolons have different diameters. They're the primary sort of storage organs of white clover. And the reality is you become more open, stolons can be targeted by animals as feed. And so having stolons that are tightly rooted to the ground and protected from overgrazing is quite high. So when it's in a grass world, it's not as big a deal. In a grass world, it's all about competition with grass, not the threat of overgrazing by animals. And so I see brace as a dominant part of your pasture mix when what you are fighting is high grass production, particularly in winter and spring. And I see mixing it with a medium large leaf type when your pastures do degrade and become more open. And if that's a common theme, yes, you might want the resilience of a medium large leaf to be added to it.
Cool.
So,
ding.
Yeah.
Well, brace yourself. We've got to the end of this podcast, and we've been talking about Brace, the large leaf white clover, the all-season producer. But as you say, Alistair, big bad Brace. Certainly a new generation of the large leaf, improved productivity in all seasons. But you make a really good point around that being present in that autumn and early winter period, and for that. We always talk about it being very visual. You've mentioned that in systems that are high performance, those are the dairy systems and beef finishing, for example, and for silage production, a really good inclusion in those mixes, and that you may want to mix it with other clovers in some situations, but really from the stuff that you're seeing, it's driving a huge amount of production. So could be very, very well be a clover on its own. So that's kind of Brace. So, today, I'm identifying as a beef finisher. Would you believe?
Which you are actually.
And this Brace has really caught my eye. And so it's going to be a great match for my system. So, I'm swiping right. You've been listening to an episode of Seed Dating with Alan Juddy, and hope you can catch another episode soon.